I'll be your Prime Minister.
Hi, I'm Joseph Wyer. I'll be your Member of Opposition.
Grayson Smith, Member of Opposition. Thank you for judging.
And Roman Smith, Leader of Opposition. Thanks.
So before we actually get started with the round, would you mind sharing any experience you may have with parliamentary debate or any style of debate? Or if there's anything specific you'd like to tell us about today's debate round that you'd like to see?
I judged a couple rounds of Parli at the last Washington tournament. I did LD for 2 years, and I'm familiar with team policy as well. My judging philosophy is mostly going to be that arguments need to be refuted, and if you're saying that an argument is irrelevant, you have to really persuade me that that point is irrelevant. And generally I don't vote based on a single issue. If you have one really good issue but they have several medium issues, I'll still vote for the more issues one most of the time.
All right. Thank you.
It'd be interesting to have my round videotaped. I've done it times before. Right. So, speakers ready, and the opposition.
Yep.
Alright, and my partner. Alright. In the past, when the U.S. has been threatened, we've always responded. When our allies have been threatened, we've always responded. Now, currently today, there is a threat to the United States, and there is a threat to its allies. And that threat is actually North Korea. And that is why I and my partner stand resolved that the UN should intervene in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Therefore, as we're going to be showing you today, currently North Korea has been threatening the U.S. with rhetoric and threatening our allies with rhetoric. And as we're going to be showing you, although it's unlikely that they're going to attack, the fact is we cannot allow them to embolden themselves, and that's why we need to intervene. Now, intervene, that's where we're going to be using quite a lot in today's debate, so I'm going to define it. Intervene can be defined simply as interference in another country's affairs. And I'd like to note that all of the points that we're going to be talking about today relate in some way to North Korea, and in some way could impact its affairs. Now let's look at some harms in the current system that are resulting from the threats and the rhetoric coming from North Korea. Harm one is that the allies are being threatened. Allies are being threatened. Currently, both South Korea and Japan have received violent rhetorical threats from North Korea. That's interesting because my club is called Rhetoric. But the fact is that this rhetoric coming from North Korea, is actually very harmful because it shows that when we're not responding, when we're just letting them insult our allies and make violent threats against our allies, that's actually emboldening them, and I'm going to be showing you that in a later point. But the second harm is that the United States itself has been threatened. North Korea has actually been saying that they're going to shoot nuclear missiles at the United States and at its allies. The United States is being threatened through rhetoric. Now, although I'm going to grant that it is extremely unlikely they're actually going to do this, we cannot allow them to embolden themselves and make this risk more likely. Now, my third harm is going to be that North Korea is being emboldened. Currently, we have not been taking enough actions in order to prevent this rhetoric from escalating. And therefore, what we can see is if we continue to do nothing, our allies will feel weakened. Now, obviously, you disagree.
Well, harms 1 and 2, you say that our allies in the U.S. is being threatened. Do we currently have a missile defense system to defend ourselves, or are you saying that they could be able to strike the U.S.?
What I'm saying basically is that by allowing this rhetoric to go by without any kind of response at all is simply not good because it's emboldening North Korea. Therefore, the very fact that we're letting this go by could provoke them to an action because their leader is very young and he's also a very weird person. Now, I'd like to now move on to a background point, actually. And the background point is simply that North Korea responds to pressure. North Korea responds to pressure. Whenever we put extreme pressure upon them in the past, they've almost always given in and relented. Therefore, we need to put pressure on them in order that they'll see the error of their ways. Because North Korea is essentially like a dog. If you allow the dog to become too bold, it might bite you. However, if you cower the dog and let you know that you're the master, then the dog will submit. And the same goes for North Korea. We can see this through history. So now what will our plan actually do? Our first mandate is to freeze North Korean officials' assets. Again, that's freeze North Korean officials' assets. This isn't targeting the people. This is actually the officials of the government. Their assets that they have abroad. We're going to freeze these so as to weaken them. But obviously, you disagree.
Actually, back to the background point of North Korea response to pressure, could you give me an example of where pressure has been positive in terms of trying to mitigate the North Korean threat?
I believe that there was a few years ago, I can't remember the specific instance, but a few years ago in the news, what happened was that North Korea was making a lot of threats. However, when we got China and we put pressure on them, they actually relented and started to come to the table more. So what we can see is that this is indeed true by looking at history. But our second mandate is going to be that we should sanction the North Korea allies banks. We should sanction North Korea allies banks. And this might seem a little confusing. What we're saying is that the foreign banks that have actually been lending money to North Korea's nuclear program, and there are banks that have been doing this, we should actually sanction them, which I believe that maybe one country has started to do this, but we need to do it more. The UN needs to actually impose specific sanctions upon the nuclear program so that we can actually weaken the nuclear program, and we need to do this because this is the way that they'll see that we're the boss. Now, our third mandate is that we should show support for South Korea and Japan. Again, that's show support for South Korea and Japan. And when I mean support, I don't mean actually militarily intervening against North Korea, because that's not what the definition of intervening was. I mean actually having military exercises in these countries and showing that we would be willing to support them if North Korea attacked them. Again, that's if North Korea attacked them, we would support them militarily. Currently, I don't believe that we've been saying enough to this effect. We've been saying a little bit, but we need to do more. We need to actually be conducting military exercises with Japan and South Korea and showing our support by maybe sending some troops or battleships up there to show that we actually support. And this might seem like a foolhardy idea. However, as we've already showed you through history, that North Korea responds in a very weird way to pressure. Once we start putting pressure on them, showing them that we're the masters, they will cow down. And that is our advantages. Our first advantage is that North Korea will be cowed. North Korea will be cowed. Essentially, they'll realize that they've gone too far and that they need to back down. If their assets are frozen, that will pinch them economically, and those officials will realize that it actually affects them, and it's not just affecting their people. These sanctions will cut to the heart of the matter. Also, we'll be seeing that when they see that the nuclear program is weakened, and that's our second advantage, the nuclear program weakened, that they'll also once again be cowed because they'll see that we're no longer willing to stand by and just let them make violent threats against our allies and us. And our third advantage is that South Korea will be emboldened. Again, that South Korea will be emboldened. Once we conduct military exercises with South Korea and Japan and show that we are indeed supporting them, then they will feel more emboldened if North Korea should actually attack them. So in the end, today what we've seen is that clearly North Korea currently is making threats against South Korea, Japan, and the United States. And we need to resolve this issue. And actually, I'd like to provide one more point. And that is that we need to actually put pressure on China. Now, you might ask yourself, what does China have to do with the equation? Well, China is actually a big-time ally or not an ally, but a very close friend with North Korea. And if we put pressure on China, actually, to tell North Korea to stop doing what they're doing, in other words, if China withdraws its support from North Korea, then North Korea will cow down. And so that's actually another mandate that we have, is that we need to put pressure on China. The U.S. needs to put political, and the UN needs to put political pressure on China to pressure North Korea, because North Korea listens to China sometimes. So what we can clearly see is that there is a harm in the current system. Our nation and our national security and the other nations around us that are allies are being threatened. Although this threat is distant, it only becomes worse if we refuse to do nothing. We need to hit the pockets of these officials, and we also need to show support for our allies. And that is why I am proud to propose.
You ready? And the government? My partner? All right. What I'm going to be showing to you in this speech is a few different things. First, we're going to be looking at the topicality of the affirmative team's plan, whether or not it really conforms to the resolution given to us today. And along with that, we're going to be looking at harm responses, a disadvantage, as well as a counter plan to the affirmative team. But before we get into any of that, we're going to look at topicality. Now, the resolutions of today, of this parliamentary debate round says, the United Nations should intervene in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. So before we get into my topicality argument, let's go to the definition of intervene that they had. Now, the definition of intervene was to basically interfere in another country's affairs. Now, the problem is that in the context of the resolution, we have to intervene in North Korea. That's what the resolution tells us. If the resolution said we should intervene in the nuclear program situation with North Korea, we should intervene in all the stuff that's been happening with North Korea, just the general situation, their plan will be topical. But what the counterplan says is that we need to intervene in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The very fact that they use the official name of the country implies that we may have to be intervening within the specific country. So that's the interpretation of the opposition in today's debate for topicality, is in the country. The government team, in order to fall under this resolution, has to do something intervening specifically in the North Korean country. Now let's go to the violation of they added another mandate at the end of their speech. We're going to go to their 4 mandates. The first mandate was freeze North Korean officials' assets overseas. Basically, if they have assets in China or the United States or in Germany or any of these other countries, those assets are frozen. This is not in the country of North Korea. It is a policy that China and Germany and the United States and other countries might take by themselves. Yes, take your question.
Now, essentially, our definition of intervene was interference in another country's affairs. Now, don't you agree that when we're sanctioning this country and getting involved in this country's affairs, doesn't that apply to the definition of intervene?
What I was saying was that your definition of intervene was not good in the context of the resolution. In the context of the resolution, it says we should intervene in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. As I said, the fact that it uses the name of the country shows that this has to be within the country itself. It doesn't say we should intervene in the nuclear situation. It says we should intervene in that country, which implies that the action taken by the affirmative team has to be specifically in the country of North Korea. So their first mandate, as I just said, it does not have to do with North Korea. It's countries like China or other countries that North Korean officials have assets in. It's those countries taking actions by themselves, not doing anything to North Korea, just taking assets in their country. The second mandate was to sanction North Korea's allies' banks. The problem with this is that, once again, the banks are not in North Korea. The banks would be in other countries. For example, if there's a bank in China that they've been borrowing money from, that bank would be sanctioned, but that is not in North Korea. That's sanctioning a bank in China. That's intervening in China, not in North Korea. The third mandate and fourth mandate basically had to do with showing support and pressure. The third mandate was showing support for South Korea and Japan. Again, this is not in North Korea. The presence, the actions of the military in the United States and the United Nations would be in South Korea and Japan. The fourth mandate was pressure in China, again, not in North Korea. So let's go to the standards of this topicality argument. The first standard is that of ground. Now, I have right here what I prepared for this debate round, which was intervening in North Korea, but none of it applies because the affirmative team isn't actually under the resolution. My partner and I prepped for this back in the prep room, and none of actually what we prepped applies because they're not actually falling under the resolution. So they've stolen the ground of the negative team, basically made it impossible for us to debate with what we prepped, given they chose a non-topical case. And if it was team policy, it would be different because we'd have a brief, but given this parliamentary, we only had 15 minutes prep for the round, so this is a real issue. The second standard is that of grammar. In the context of the resolution, it says we should intervene in North Korea. That word "in" is extremely important grammatically because it doesn't say we should intervene around North Korea or with North Korea in North Korea. That's very grammatically important. The impacts of this topicality argument are simply education and competitive equity, which simply means that first, the affirmative team has reduced education, but second, they've also reduced the competitive equity of today's debate round by skewing the debate towards their side by choosing a plan that is not topical. But now that we've gone through that, which clearly is the main issue in today's debate, we're going to go through a counter plan. Now, before we get to that, let's go to their advantage of nuclear program weakened. Now, the fact is that the affirmative team will not actually weaken the nuclear program in North Korea because any funding that they have left over from taxes on their country or whatever, any funding that they still have left over goes all to their nuclear program because the North Korean government disproportionately funds that nuclear program. So what we can see from that is that the affirmative team cannot actually stop the nuclear program of North Korea. So let's look at a counter plan that will. Yeah?
Essentially, if we're taking money that's going to the nuclear program with our plan, doesn't that weaken the nuclear program?
It could weaken the nuclear program, so to speak, but it won't actually stop the nuclear program because North Korea can still get money from taxes on their people or trying to get money from other sources. Basically, the fact is that any money that the North Korean government has goes towards its nuclear program. It's a communist government, doesn't care about the people, so unlike the United States, there's not welfare programs and such like that go towards the people. All their funding goes towards the nuclear program because that's their primary goal. So now let's look at the counter plan. The counter plan is basically missile defense, boost phase missile defense. And what this essentially means is that we will put boost phase interceptors, and the boost phase is basically the start of a nuclear missile's launch. It's just leaving the launch pad. That's called the boost phase. Now what we're going to do is we're going to put interceptors on top of unmanned aerial vehicles, which are otherwise referred to as drones, which will patrol outside the borders of North Korea to shoot down their test missiles. Now how this will stop North Korea's nuclear program is if we do this, if the drones are to shoot down North Korea's test nuclear nuclear missiles, this means that they won't be able to advance with their nuclear program to actually get information and learn from it. You're going to shoot down their test missiles every time they try to test it and try to increase their technology. So if we do this, that means that we will actually be able to weaken the nuclear program. We will put pressure on North Korea, and we will stop North Korea. The affirmative team made the point that they can put pressure on North Korea economically to try and stop them. Basically, they made the point that with economic pressure through the sanctions on the various areas, they can stop North Korea. My response to this is sanctions don't work. The United Nations has applied, the United Nations Security Council, has applied round after round of sanctions to North Korea, and it simply has not worked. We just actually, about a month ago, the United Nations Security Council applied another round of sanctions to North Korea, but according to South Korean officials, North Korea is about to do another nuclear test. Clearly, economic pressure on North Korea simply does not fix the problem. What will fix the problem of North Korea's nuclear program is a robust, ready missile defense system given to you by the negative team that will stop North Korea's nuclear program from advancing by actually stopping the testing from being productive. That's what we do. The affirmative team offers you a weak pressure that has empirically not worked against North Korea, and whereas the government, not the affirmative team, and the opposition team, we offer you a real pressure that can work against North Korea that not only pressures them, but actually puts real force against them to stop them from obtaining a nuclear weapon. Thank you.
Is everyone ready? All right. Now, let's start off with their argument of topicality. Basically, first they said, this has to be in Korea itself, and the reason behind this was that our definition was not good. First of all, they didn't actually counter-define intervention. What we did, we Googled intervention. First definition, we took which means intervention was defined as interference in another country's affairs. If they didn't look up the definition of intervene, that's kind of their fault. It's too bad that they misinterpreted intervention. Basically, I'm going to go back to topicality just quickly. Now, basically what they said was it has to be in Korea itself. But since the definition is in the affairs, all we have to do is affecting their affairs, and our plan clearly does affect the affairs of North Korea. Now, moving over to their critique, I said, they said, well, this skews the equity of the debate, but this is not our fault. Maybe they didn't look up the definition of intervention, but you disagree.
My question is, if the United States were to stop trade with China, so they're forced to trade with North Korea more, would that be intervening in North Korea?
Can you repeat the question?
If the United States were to stop trading with China, so that China was forced to trade more with North Korea to balance that, so that would affect North Korea's affairs, would that be the United States intervening in North Korea?
In a way, but it's not in the same way. Moving over to their counter plan of missile defense, basically they said we're going to use interceptors to stop, so Korea won't have any reason to build their nuclear program. But because they don't provide any way to stop North Korea from being emboldened, this is provoking war, because essentially what we're doing is we're cowing North Korea, but they are just provoking war with them, because under their counter plan, North Korea won't have any reasons will still be emboldened, which, as we said, provokes war. Now, moving over to their arguments against our mandates, they said, this is affecting other countries, or this is about other countries. But I have group response to everything that they said in argument against that. Group response basically say, as we already said, our definition, which is a clear definition, makes sense, which they didn't define. Therefore, it still applies, because we are affecting the affairs of North Korea. We are intervening in the affairs of North Korea.
Didn't I bring up a counter definition of intervening in the country of North Korea? Has to be.
That wasn't. No, you did not. You essentially said, well, this is what it is. You didn't actually. You didn't provide a counter. You never said counter definition. Now, and then they said, well, we can't stop the sanction under point 2, mandate 2. I believe they said, well, this won't stop North Korea but they actually admitted it weakens their nuclear program, which means that we're slowing down their nuclear program and they'll have less reason to continue it. Now, and then in response to Mandate 3, they said sanctions don't work. Well, we're actually talking about different kinds of sanctions, taking money that the foreign banks lend to North Korea. It's not the same kind of sanctions. And now moving on to by your screen.
Could you let me know which banks you will be shutting down or sanctioning rather with your plan? Are the banks in China, banks in Russia, which banks?
The banks that are lending money, they're the main banks that are lending money to the nuclear program.
Right, so could you give me a name? In a country? In China maybe?
I don't have a specific, but these are the main banks that are supporting their program. Now, moving over to, let's see. Now, actually, I'm just going to let my partner just continue to expound on what I said. Oh.
There you go. Judge, ready? Can the government team? Words change meanings when you put them into context, and words change meanings when you put them in a phrase. For example, the word ice refers to frozen water. The word cream is like whipped cream. But if you put those two together, that doesn't mean that you have whipped cream on blocks of ice. It means you have ice cream. Words definitely change when you put them in context or when you put them with other words. That's exactly the opposition stance. One definition of intervene may be a more generic definition that doesn't have to do with involving in a country's affairs. But the resolution specifically said intervene in. We're taking those words, intervene in, and saying it means actually in the country, not with the country. The example that Roman gave in the question, in the point of information, was actually a very good example. That if we were to cut off trade with China, that would affect China's trade with North Korea because they have to do more trade with North Korea to compensate for the lack of trade with the U.S. But is that the U.S. intervening in North Korea? Definitely not. We may affect North Korea with that plan, but that itself isn't intervening in North Korea. That's really the main argument of the opposition on the topicality. The government team said a couple things under this topicality. One, they said that we had no counter definition for the word intervene, but actually Roman did. He said specifically the resolution intervene in means that we have to get involved in the country. The word intervene, even if the government definition is true with the word intervene, it still doesn't uphold the resolution because they still have to do that action in the country. So even if you agree with their definition, they're still not topical because they're not acting inside the country. Yes?
Don't you think that's something that's actually happening in the country's affairs? For example, their nuclear program weakening or their government weakening happens inside North Korea?
No, because none of your mandates are inside North Korea. Your mandate 1 is to freeze officials' assets in other countries. Your mandate 2 is to freeze allies' banks in other countries. Your mandate 3 is to support South Korea and Japan. Your mandate 4 is to pressure China. None of those are inside, geographically, the country of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Yes?
But if the country is affected inside the country, they're unable to continue with their nuclear program, for example. Isn't that
it does, because the action isn't in North Korea. The intervention may affect something in North Korea, but the intervention itself isn't in North Korea. The resolution states the UN has to intervene in North Korea, not do an action with intervention that will cause changes in North Korea. Specifically, the Gov must intervene in North Korea. And additionally, intervene is, the word intervene refers to a force coming between two different obstacles, something that intervenes between two opposing objects. And the government plan really isn't this at all. It's dealing with other countries outside North Korea. It's not in North Korea. It's not intervention. Clearly, the government plan doesn't uphold the resolution. Now, with that address, we have to realize that given the government doesn't uphold the resolution, they haven't upheld their burden in the debate round. The government ballot is only justified if they uphold the resolution. If you vote for the government, you're voting for an approval of the resolution. But if they haven't approved the resolution, then the resolution isn't justified. And again, voting for the government plan decreases education by going outside the resolution and decreases competitive equity by going outside the resolution, not debating what we're supposed to debate. Now, with that address, let's turn to the counterplan. Their main argument against the counterplan was that the counterplan doesn't solve for emboldening North Korea. Two responses. First of all, the plan doesn't work. The plan doesn't work. The government plan specifically doesn't work because in the past, economic pressure on North Korea has actually failed very badly. For example, we've had sanctions on North Korea for 60 years. And they've still done 3 nuclear tests, are planning another nuclear test in a couple weeks, and they've done dozens of missile tests. Another example, back in February 2013, right after they did their third nuclear test, the UN placed the toughest sanctions ever on North Korea. What was their response? To vow nuclear war on the United States. It's very clear that economic pressure does not work against North Korea. History denies the solvency of the government case, and thus the government plan does not solve the issue of emboldening North Korea. But my second response is that the counterplan destroys all progress. The counterplan destroys all progress. You see, even if North Korea were to feel strong by trying to launch their missiles, if we shoot down their missiles, we don't care if they feel strong, because they can't do anything. If North Korea physically cannot hit any of the United States or our allies with their weapons, with their missiles, it doesn't matter how strongly they feel about the issue. They simply can't do anything, so it doesn't matter. You seem to disagree?
Yes, I do, because essentially you're saying that we should send drones near the North Korean border and shoot down essentially any hostile objects or forces that are coming out of there. However, if we do this, couldn't this possibly actually provoke conflict with North Korea, is my question.
Well, yeah, there's a couple things to examine here. One, shooting down test missiles of a nuclear weapon and missiles are actually justifiable by United Nations resolutions. So when it comes to international law, North Korea would have absolutely no standing to try and argue against the United States with this. Secondly, even if the plan were to provoke North Korea, there's two issues here. One, both plans could provoke North Korea, so really this argument applies to both plans. But secondly, if they can't do anything with the provocation that we've caused, it really doesn't matter. See, the counterplan solves the issue, and even if it does provoke North Korea, it doesn't matter because it solves the issue. The government plan doesn't solve the issue, but still provokes North Korea. Yes?
So are you putting these missile emplacements in North Korea?
Not over the airspace, no. They'll be
It's not in North Korea?
No.
Okay.
Yes, our counterplan is not upholding the resolution, and our counterplan isn't the UN either, it's the United States. So, yeah, that's clarified. With that address, listeners, the final argument they contested is whether or not the government plan, or whether or not the government plan weakens North Korea's program. Now, I assume they were pointing back to when Roman said in his speech that it could weaken the program when they asked him to point the information. And yes, it is true. Their plan could have some effect on North Korea's nuclear program. But two things. One, it most likely won't, because history totally denies it having effect. And actually, the mandates of the affirmative plan are actually much less drastic than everything else we've done in North Korea to try and stop their nuclear program. Much less pressure is put on North Korea by the government plan than for previous plans we have passed with the United Nations. But secondly, it would be an insignificant weakening of the nuclear program, very insignificant, because as Roman said, North Korea diverts all of their resources toward their nuclear program. So even if the affirmative team cuts the funding to the North Korean government by 1/5, North Korea will still use the 4/5 of their funding to get their nuclear program. It may take them longer, but they will still get there, and regardless of the affirmative plan, North Korea will be able to strike the United States and our allies. But with the counter plan, they can't, because their missiles can't even be tested, so they don't even know if they can make progress. Sure, they can try and fire a missile, but if they haven't tested it, it obviously won't work. At the end of the day, we really have to realize a couple things. One, the affirmative plan, the government plan rather, doesn't uphold the resolution. It doesn't get involved in the country of North Korea. It may affect North Korea, but that's not what the resolution calls for. They can talk about a different resolution all they want. They can uphold a different resolution all they want. But since they're not upholding this resolution, and given specifically, the resolution calls the country by its official name, the Democratic People Republic of Korea. It's very clear that it's talking about in North Korea. The government plan doesn't uphold the resolution and isn't justified. The counter plan solves the harms better and actually upholds the opposition burden. Vote for the opposition because we solve the problem and protect the United States. Thank you. All right, if you're ready. And the government? Chris? Yep.
All right. In the final opposition speech of this parliamentary debate round, what I'm going to be doing is boiling the round down into three main voting issues. Three reasons that I would ask you to vote for the opposition and not the government. We're going to start with the first voting issue, which is that of topicality. Now let's quickly reiterate what my partner said and just point out why the topicality argument is so true. Now, as my partner said, context matters. And I actually ran an argument of this in my speech of a standard of grammar. I'd like to point out the affirmative team, really all they said in their speech was, well, we had a definition and you didn't. But that's not actually true. I had a definition, my interpretation of the resolution was that they have to intervene in the country of North Korea because of the context of the resolution. I definitely had a definition there. And if the affirmative team seems to be implying that you need to have a definition from some sort of source, like Google or something, to make it real, but given parliamentary debate isn't actually supposed to have sources, we can assume in the debate round that their definition is just them talking, so if my definition is just me talking, it's practically the same thing. So what I had in my definition was two standards of ground and grammar. First of
that they stole the ground of the negative team by running a non-topical case. I actually have paper over there of what my partner wrote down in the 15 minutes of preparation about what intervening in North Korea would mean, but given they're not doing that, none of it applies. Additionally, look to the standard of bright line, which basically means there has to be a clear area of what is topical and what is not topical. The affirmative team says that their plan, it could affect North Korea by doing all these different things, but that doesn't. It's not very clear what's topical and what's not. For example, if the United States were to decrease its tax rates, yeah, that could lead to a decrease of revenue, which could lead to a worse economy, which could lead to us trading with China to increase our economy, which could lead to China balancing that by trading less with North Korea, which could lead to them having less money to put into their nuclear program. You could go through all those different steps and try and link almost anything to North Korea's nuclear program being affected. I could link me not going to college with that because eventually I would not be a tax-paying citizen given I wouldn't get as good a degree, and then that could affect it through that whole thing. If there's anything you could link to that, there's no bright line about what is topical and what is not under the affirmative team's interpretation, whereas there is under us. Either you're intervening in North Korea or you're not. So topicality clearly goes to the opposition team with the impacts of education and fairness. Now let's go to the voting issue 2, which is of history denies. Now the affirmative team has said that North Korea responds to economic pressure, and that's good, but as my partner and I have been saying multiple times in today's debate round, that simply does not line up with history. Let's look at the history of missile defense and the history of economic pressure. Now with economic pressure, whenever the United Nations has put sanctions on North Korea, sanction, by the way, just meaning an economic penalty. I mean, penalizing their officials' assets or banks or whatever, those definitely count as sanctions, given it's just trying to economically penalize that. So sanctions, when we put those on North Korea in the past, they've responded extremely negatively with an extremely hostile nature. The last round of sanctions we put on them resulted in the North Korean government threatening to fire nuclear weapons at the United States. That's what economic pressure results in. The government, is the one that results in provoking North Korea. Look at the history of missile defense, though. The United States actually recently just increased our missile defense in Alaska and California by about 14 ground-based mid-course interceptors. Mid-course defense doesn't work, but that's beside the point. We've increased our missile defense in the status quo, and that has not provoked North Korea whatsoever. North Korea's strong statements have been in response to economic sanctions, not missile defense. So basically what that means is that history denies that the affirmative team's plan will work, given economic penalties on North Korea have only made it worse. Economic pressure doesn't work. And the voting issue 3 is an effective solution. Under the counterplan, I'd like to point out that the affirmative team in the last speech did not contest the effectiveness of the plan. Really all they said was that it could provoke North Korea. They did not respond to the fact that it will shoot down their test missiles, it will stop their nuclear program, and they can't come up and do that in the next speech, given that would be abusive, and I'll call a point of order on them if they do that. Basically what we're saying here is that the missile defense that we're putting in place, it is the one that will actually stop North Korea's nuclear program. You can't stop their nuclear program through economic sanctions, because as my partner said, they will just funnel more funding towards the nuclear program from their funding sources they have left, because they're a communist government. They don't care about the people, they care about their own political goals. That's what the government will do, that's what I said in my speech. History has shown that. So what we're doing instead is we're saying, okay, forget the economic sanctions, we're going to do something that's actually effective. It doesn't matter if North Korea wants to pursue a nuclear weapon if you vote for us, because we'll stop them from getting one. We'll shoot down their test missiles, and if by some random happenstance they happen to get a nuclear weapon, we'll shoot that one down too. We protect the entire world from North Korea if you were to vote for our counterplan. The affirmative team's plan is a historically proven failure, and the government opposition, and the opposition team's counterplan is a historically proven success. So I ask you to vote for the counterplan given to you by the opposition, because 1, it's not on the resolution because it shouldn't be. 2nd, history proves it true. And 3rd, is an effective solution which the affirmative team hasn't agreed to. Thank you.
Mark, is the speaker ready? And the opposition? Well, after 2 very eloquent speeches by the opposition, you're probably tempted to vote for them. However, as I can be showing in this last speech, several of the key issues they presented are actually completely false, and I'm going to be showing that through my voting issues. But first of all, my first voting issue will be that topicality falls. Topicality falls. And when I mean falls, I mean that their whole argument falls. Because the fact is that in their first speech, I never heard them actually say that they were going to counter-define this issue. Now, they kind of brought it up in their second speech and tried to bring it up, but no, they never actually specifically stated they were counter-defining in the first speech. So it's abuse of them to say it, that, they snuck it in, so now they're counter-defining it now. No, they didn't actually state that they were counter-defining it in their first speech, so therefore they can't bring it up now because they actually never stated a counter-definition. They just simply said, oh, the word in. Well, they can't counter-define intervene or intervene as in because that simply doesn't make sense. Therefore, they never specifically stated a clear counter-definition. Therefore, it's not fair of them to bring it up now. So what we can clearly see is that none of their topicality arguments apply because although you may think that our definition is not really common knowledge, however, the fact is because they never specifically stated a counter-definition, we have no choice but to go with the government counter-definition, or the definition that we provided originally. But second of all, I'd like to actually point out that our plan actually falls under both definitions because our plan actually applies in North Korea. The nuclear program, which is going on in North Korea, is affected because when we're cutting off funding from the nuclear program, this nuclear program is losing money, and this is in North Korea. Also, the officials are in North Korea whose assets were freezing abroad. Yes, this is abroad, however, it also applies in North Korea. So at the end of the day, even if you buy some of their arguments, the fact is that our definition still falls under their definition because our policies are in fact affecting inside of North Korea. Therefore, we can clearly see that our plan is clearly topical and this entire issue does not stand. But my second voting issue is that war happens if you vote opposition. Again, that's war happens if you vote opposition. My partner touched upon this in his last speech, but I'd like to kind of expound upon this. The fact is that... Okay,
I believe your partner asked a question about this, but did not make an argument in the 2AC.
Oh, actually, I've written down on my flow that he essentially said that North Korea would be provoked by this action. Sorry if I missed that, but I do believe my partner made this argument because I have it on my flow. What we can see is that if indeed they are actually, North Korea is being made mad by them having these drones upon their border, the fact is that this would actually be provoking North Korea. And actually, they stated in this last speech, they stated that we made this argument, I believe. Therefore, I'm not really sure where they're going with this point of order, but the fact is that it would, by putting these drones on their border, be potentially provoking North Korea. Also, I'd like to point out that in my next voting issue, the government plan will work. Let's look actually at the government plan specifically, looking at the mandates. What we can see is that, first of all, Judge, we're freezing the assets of these North Korean officials. Now, this is actually a different kind of sanction with the nuclear program. We're cutting off funding from the banks, and we're essentially cleaning up by freezing the North Korean officials' assets. So when we're cutting off the funding that they're getting from these foreign banks, Judge, this is actually clearly going to be a different kind of sanction that we've done in the past because the sanctions they were talking about were a different kind of sanction. Therefore, they said history supports us. Well, this is a different kind of sanction would be my response to that argument. But I'd also like to point out that actually history supports the government team. If you remember in my first speech when they asked me a question about a specific example, I said that a few years ago there was actually an instance of where a sanction did indeed work. Therefore, what we can see is that pressure does actually sometimes work. We pointed out in our background point, which I don't believe they ever completely thoroughly refuted, but the point is that this background point showed how in North Korea, essentially when we put a lot of pressure on them, when we begin to respond to their threats effectively, then North Korea is actually cowed. So let's step back. If you look at both plans, which plan is actually more effective? Their plan, as we showed you, actually doesn't really solve for the problems that we presented of emboldening North Korea, etc., etc. While our plan, on the other hand, actually cuts funding for several key issues that North Korea has, their military program, and it freezes their assets. Also, the point about China, which they briefly touched upon, but I think was a very important point, is that we're putting political pressure upon China to stop the problems that are going on inside of North Korea because they often listen to China. And finally, Judge, I'd like to point out that we are showing support for our allies. These military exercises are clearly showing support for our allies and therefore are very important. Because once North Korea realizes that we are actually no longer to take their rhetoric lightly, then they'll be cowed. So I'd like you to look at the advantage that we presented. Have we solved for these advantages? Yes, we have. North Korea will be cowed. We've also seen the nuclear program will be harmed by cutting this funding. And finally, South Korea will be emboldened. We need to support our allies, and we need to stop North Korea's violent threats. And it starts by voting for the government team. Thank you.
Good job. Good job. Good job. Thank you for judging.